Welcome back. We're here with Gina and with Brian, and we're going to explore the next chapters of Jim Collins, The Culture of Discipline. What, in reading this chapter, what resonated with you? What stood out?
Having to operate within a disciplined framework. Applying, having the right people, and then having the opportunity and a discipline to then move forward within that framework, knowing exactly what you're going to do and be good at, and then having the disciplined people to be around that framework in order to pursue what you're trying to pursue.
And what is that framework that you're referring to?
Hedgehog's concept.
Hedgehog.
Yes.
Okay, so
yes.
we're referring back to the prior chapter, the hedgehog concept, the three circles, and that provides this disciplined thought, and that allows us to then move towards disciplined action within that culture, right?
One of the things I found interesting about the chapter was that a culture of discipline doesn't have to be led by a tyrant. Actually the best cultures are self-disciplined. That people know what actions to take themselves without having to have a tyrant stand over them and make sure, which kind of is different than what pop culture will show you.
And he presents an example of a company. Do you remember? Rubbermaid. It was the example of a tyrant, you could say,
Yes.
or the genius with 1,000 helpers, the
Yes.
person that was able to sort of just simply run the company, quote unquote, with almost like disciplinarian approach. And once that person was out, the company fell apart because the culture wouldn't sustain it, right? And so in the leadership transition, that's where Collins oftentimes suggests, that's when you see whether there is a culture of discipline. Because as you're saying, are people self-disciplined? Are those the right people that are able to do this job even without being told to do X, Y, Z, right? And I think that's really different from the traditional way of looking at organizing and management.
Absolutely. Another interesting example that he provides in the chapters I appreciated was the rinsing of the cottage cheese. The triathlete that burned $5,000 calories a day, but would still rinse his cottage cheese because he wanted to maintain a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, which obviously you don't need to do burning 5,000 calories a day, but he thought it would give him an edge in competition. So he was that self-disciplined that he would.
Right. So that's the move towards excellence, right?
Yes.
It's like, oh, okay, yes, I'm rinsing my cottage cheese, even though there's not much fat in that to begin with, but and I can burn calories otherwise. But yes, I'm gonna like have that discipline to move every piece that I have under my control in some way. Interesting. Can you just sort of read the introductory quote that Collins puts in front of that chapter? It's by Viktor Frankl.
Freedom is only part of the story and half of the truth. That is why I recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplanted by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast.
Statue of Responsibility. Why would Collins put this at the head of this chapter? What does this point to? Freedom and responsibility, right? We celebrate the Statue of Liberty. That's sort of like the grand achievement of the United States. And Frankl is saying that's not enough. There needs to be more than just freedom. There needs to be this statue of responsibility. How does this connect with this chapter? Why would he put it there?
Well, I think you know, when you're thinking about culture of discipline, you have to give kind of a duality. You have to give people, you know, the ability to work within a framework, but the freedom to be able to do certain things themselves within their job or responsibility. And having that balance, I think, is central to having disciplined people with disciplined thought and then producing disciplined action as a result.
In your sort of work life, how do people interpret freedom?
It's a very interesting question, actually. Now that I kind of reflect on it for a second, in a lot of ways, I think people take freedom and it's an interpretation of their responsibilities for the company. It shows confidence in the individual employees for them to have freedom to go and do the right thing that they're supposed to do. The more that you kind of micromanage or take them along to every single task, the less freedom that they have. So I think it shows trust and confidence when you give your employees freedom.
But what's the typical understanding of freedom? What sort of...
Great question. Guess to do whatever you like to do, whenever you want to do it.
Whenever you want to do it, whatever. No discipline,
Right,
right?
no discipline.
Absence of
Right,
constraint.
sure,
There's
sure.
nothing, no framework around it. Freedom is, I can do whatever I want, whenever I want it, et cetera, et cetera. That's this sort of almost quote unquote immature understanding of freedom, right? Because that's not how anybody feels very free. Oftentimes they're just basically just hiding from any kind of responsibility when they're saying I can do whatever I want, whenever I want it. And in these excellent organizations, what Collins is saying, no, people are operating differently. They have a different understanding of freedom. And I would interpret that Collins is putting this quote ahead of this chapter is sort of alluding to the fact that we might be, as a culture and sort of overall, misunderstanding the notion of freedom. It's not about I can do whatever I want whenever I want it, which is maybe important, but there's something more to it. It's like, okay, I'm going to behave in a responsible way, and that responsibility is actually allowing me and encouraging that freedom further, right? That's moving me forward in terms of my development. That's moving the company also forward in that. And that moves societies forward in a way that's like, okay, you know what? I can't just do whatever I want, whenever I want it, whatever that may mean. But yeah, I am actually bound by certain principles. And once I have those, I will operate with that. And I think that's what Collins is alluding to with this culture of discipline, right? It's not like, okay, you don't have freedom. You have a different kind of freedom. Does that resonate?
It does. You know, the metaphor or example I think of is, if you look at the freedom, what's the counter to not counter to freedom, but the complement to freedom is like the military, the culture of discipline that protects freedom, right? And so it just that's a thought that came across my mind when we were talking about that.
What about you? How is your organization looking at freedom?
I think for us, the freedom is being able to be free to think and do without the constraints of what you were hired to do. Think outside the box, be innovative, and have the freedom to do that. You know, sometimes we get stuck in the day-to-day of our jobs, and so we have taken a more innovative approach, I guess it seems, in terms of if you have an idea, write it down. Let's talk about it. From that comes a program, could come a service. We don't know. But don't get so bogged down in your day-to-day that you're not having the time and freedom to do different type of thinking for different type of creativity.
Now, if we go back to the chapter, if you have it, there are a number of categorizations that he uses in terms of different types of cultures, right? There's a disciplinarian culture, there's a culture of discipline. They're not the same. Then he has a number of other concepts, the bureaucratic culture, right? And an entrepreneurial type of culture, right? So in that sense, maybe you can just go back to the classification there, and then what do these concepts represent? Like, how would you interpret an authoritarian culture? We talked about this a little bit, but a bureaucratic culture that is mainly basically what people are don't really appreciate, right?
Yeah. So a bureaucratic culture, the way he defines it is through a lack of discipline, and it builds over time to compensate for incompetence within or mediocrity. That's how he characterizes the bureaucratic culture. The disciplinarian culture is kind of what we discussed earlier, a micromanaging culture that is very focused on dictating the tasks to subordinates.
And in what way, where's the sweet spot? We talked about the culture of discipline, but let's just sort of like unpack this a little bit more, because there's more to that. When does it work? Because I mean, most of the organizations don't necessarily practice a culture of discipline.
Right.
They have a bureaucratic culture, they may have an entrepreneurial culture, or they may have an authoritarian type of culture, right, in some way hierarchical. What is required for this to work?
Is it the ethic of entrepreneurship and then having a disciplined culture? Like when those two things meet, is when your people feel empowered to make decisions, and but also make the right decisions.
And what are the right decisions? Just to sort of recapitulate there, what would help us understand what a right decision is?
I guess that would go back to the concept of the hedgehog,
Yeah.
making the right decisions within that framework.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we're getting pieces and bits and pieces and see how, okay, who the right people are matters, because that is where the culture then comes out. And it's not just like you can do anything you want, right? It's not this freedom in that context, like, okay, you have a good idea over there, you just do it, and where everybody's going to support you. That's oftentimes the startup type of culture or the entrepreneurial culture. On the other hand, what Collins is saying, for an organization to be excellent, actually it does need this kind of a hedgehog concept that organizes and prioritizes certain ideas, actions, etc., so that there is a discipline in that, right? And so that people understand, okay, I can do certain things and others I cannot do, right? And I think we talked about this before with the stop doing list, right? It's like, oh, okay, you know what? That people have internalized a little bit, yeah, this may work, this will help us to become better, and this may not. But the criteria is based on the hedgehog, right? Does that make sense?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
In your experience with organizations, what is the most prevalent kind of culture that you're witnessing? I think you were talking about.
We work closely with the government, federal government, so the bureaucratic culture is the most common culture.
And how is that sort of, what is the typical approach to that bureaucratic culture? It's
bureaucracy spawns more bureaucracy for itself. It exists to maintain the status quo, and it is not efficient.
Okay, it's not efficient.
Yes.
Okay, is it effective?
It can be.
It can be.
Yeah.
Achieving certain results, right?
Achieving certain results.
Right.
Yes.
So it's not like it doesn't work,
Right.
It's
It
not
does
like
work.
horrible.
Right.
It's actually, it's functional. It's
Yes.
working for a certain thing, for a certain
Sure.
objective, right? It may not be efficient, but in many cases it can be effective at producing certain results. Let's say social security or defense or whatever the objective is. And for you students, in terms of management and modern management, we talked about the official, well, the traditional way of looking at management at those two F's, right? The efficiency and the effectiveness. So many organizations are run based on effectiveness or efficiency principles, and bureaucratic organizations, the bureaucratic cultures that Collins mentions here, are oftentimes legitimated by the effectiveness that they produce. Now, how efficient they are may be a question. Many people say government organizations, bureaucratic organizations aren't very efficient, so they're trying to make them more efficient, right? That's where they were starting. The question then is, all right, well, is that enough to make an organization excellent? And what prevents this organization from even considering excellence?
I think probably one of the things that I see the most is the culture. It has a serious impact on the culture. It may be effective, but at what cost?
So the culture is relevant.
Yes.
You mentioned that before, that the culture is critical for even the right people to be there, right? And even if there's a maybe level 5 leader, if the culture of the organization doesn't replicate that humility, that inquiry, that willingness to confront the brutal facts, it really doesn't matter much, because yeah, you could be all constrained by rules, by all kinds of procedures, by maybe the mindset that, you know, good is good enough.
Right.
Good is the enemy of great, right? Or mediocre, the status quo, is what we need to deliver, right? And in many ways, the effectiveness principle can prevent organizations from simply becoming much better, right? Because they're already doing what they're supposed to do. And yeah, that's the bureaucratic organization. What about startups? I think, do you have any experience with startups? You're running one yourself?
Yes. So there's an incredible amount of excitement and ownership over it. I like to call the first kind of wave of people that join it the zealots, the people that truly believe, and then but over time. It's not structured, you know. It's just pure energy in the beginning, and then as you grow, you have the need to establish some level of bureaucracy and formalized processes inside your own organization. And it's interesting because that can sometimes have an impact on the enthusiasm and
it does
it
oftentimes.
does.
And people typically leave.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
The ones that are there for this higher purpose, the excitement, etc., they're sort of getting out, right?
Yes.
And so I think what Collins offers here is a third way. It's not just saying, okay, we're going to start up, we're going to be excited, and then we're going to put in bureaucratic rules because we need to stabilize something. But he says, no. Maybe you don't want to have bureaucratic rules, right? You don't want to move from startup to bureaucracy. Maybe you can move towards this discipline that he's talking about, this responsibility, this framework, right? Guided by the hedgehog. Yeah. Which sounds sort of kind of weird if we're talking about like that, right? What would that look like in an organization?
Well, I think in my experience is looked at as the opportunities that come and, recognizing which ones fit into that hedgehog concept and which don't. And being very disciplined about opportunities that, yes, may, allow you to make more profit, have a funder, be glad to work with you. But does it fit within our hedgehog? Are we best at what we do? Are we passionate about it? Does it fit within that sweet spot? And so a lot of times a nonprofit, when you're on limited bandwidth and resources, using the hedgehog framework is discipline to be able to shun opportunities that, very well could lead to growth, but does it fit in with the framework? So it forces you to go back to the framework, to the framework.
And it's back to the framework in a sense, and students, I want you to pay attention. We're using the term framework here, not rules, not procedures, not bureaucratic measures, okay? And because that, I think, is critical to understand. It's like, it's disciplining in a different way, right? Now, the other alternative that you can establish discipline is, of course, the authoritarian principle. That may be something that is most common in many organizations, even the army, etc. And I'm just curious in what way you have experienced that, and in what way this is functional, and in what way this may not necessarily be so functional. Any
I actually haven't had experience with that type of leadership, thankfully.
We work with military, several branches of the military, and that style works well, and especially high stress, high risk scenarios. But I will tell you that the best leaders that come out of the military are humble and are calm, and they're it's not the the stereotype of the yelling sergeant or general. They're calm, deliberate, thoughtful people.
And in what way does this culture then potentially manifest itself when there is one type of leader? Even within the military, you probably have a lot of spectrum of leadership styles and cultures, right?
Sure.
So, for example, special teams. I recall people telling me about special teams.
Special forces.
Special forces, right? They don't have the structure, right? Can you talk more about that? How that may be relevant to this conversation about the culture of discipline? Yeah,
sure. So I haven't worked directly with special forces, but I think what you're talking about there is the kind of autonomy that they're given to conduct operations.
Right.
And the freedom that they have in some of the I think that's what you're
referencing. Yeah, that's what I hear, because I wasn't part of that. But I was just surprised in a way. It's like, the military is not necessarily seen as the typical kind of freedom-based, responsibility-based culture. It's more an authoritarian one, where it's like, okay, you have the responsibility and the command chain, and you will tell if your boots are whatever, something, that's where it starts, right? If you can't sort of have the discipline to shine your boots, then you're probably not able to carry a gun, and you're not able to execute X, Y, Z. So that's sort of the notion of the authoritarian culture, or disciplinarian culture. But even within that, you see that what's workable is oftentimes something that's maybe building on the understanding that there are certain things you need to do that are part of your responsibility. But it's within the framework that you're operating outside, right? And that you're sort of understanding, okay, you're on your own in some way, still contributing to what the organization overall is trying to achieve. Does that resonate? Does it make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah.
And I think, students, I want to sort of make sure that you understand this. These conversations about culture are very critical in understanding how organizations can sustain excellence. And oftentimes this glorified leader perspective is not helpful. Is not helpful in a way to understand what makes organizations and even teams great at the long term. And the culture of discipline is a useful concept to think about. It's that people feel empowered. People are not free in a nilly-willy sense. They're actually guided by the framework, by the higher purpose that they're sort of operating with, by the passion, by what they want to achieve as being the best in the world, and what sort of allows the financial engine to sort of run the organization. In that sweet spot, in that hedgehog, that's where the discipline is drawn from. That's what good and great organizations are using to sustain themselves at a level of excellence.